Hello, and thank you for joining our Teaching for 21st Century webinar brought to you by the David Holmes Freedom Center and the Glazov Gang. I'm your host, Annie Cyrus. Please use the Q&A box on your screen if you have any questions, and I promise we will answer them as soon as our very special guest presentation is over. With that being said, it is my privilege to introduce our guest this evening, Bruce Thornton. Bruce is a professor at the California State University in Fresno. He's the author of 10 books and numerous essays. He's also a Shellman Journalist Fellow at the David Holmes Freedom Center and a Research Fellow at the Stanford Hoover Institution. Hi, Bruce. Welcome to the program.
Hello, Annie. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. We are very excited to hear all your thoughts on this topic. So, floor is yours.
Okay. As the title suggests, I'm talking about two kinds of diversity. One is you can say it's fake, or you could say it's pseudo diversity, or it's actually a political construct, or it's evolved into a political construct. It doesn't mean what most of us think diversity means. The other is real diversity, which we all know what that is, or at least those of us gathered here, I'm sure, know what that is. And I want to, in talking about these, I want to link them to the long project of the progressive movement to dismantle the constitutional structure. Because everything about diversity, with the quotation marks, and the identity politics that follow from diversity, that have been empowered by the policies created by diversity, cut against the assumptions of the founders when they set about constructing the Constitution. So that's what I'm going to try to do, and we'll see how it goes. So the first diversity, the political diversity, has a very definite birth date. It's in 1978, a Supreme Court decision called Bakke versus Regents of the University of California. And it involved an affirmative action program that was challenged by an applicant, a white applicant. And the problem with the program was that it used set-asides that were like quotas. And the Civil Rights Act said you can't do quotas. You can't have numerical quotas that you set aside. Now, we would think that given that any affirmative action program is discriminatory, that's on the face of it, it has to be, they would have used this opportunity to say, you know, we passed the Civil Rights Act, we can't have these sorts of programs. Right? You have to get to work and figure out some other way, whatever the problem is you think it's going to solve. But they didn't do that. And what they did instead was refurbish affirmative action programs so they could meet, at least superficially, the limits of the law. And Justice Powell did this by introducing the idea of diversity. Now, there was a kind of bait and switch going on because we've been talking about diversity in America for years because of the immigrants that come to this country. They used to call it pluralism, let's say in the 30s or 40s, but it's the same idea. We are not a blood and soil nation. So most people, when they thought, yeah, diversity is a good thing, you know, the more ideas, the more minds, et cetera, the better. But the only diversity that they had in mind were the very vague, to almost a point of meaningless, racial categories that were created by scientific racism of the late 19th, early 20th century, that misapplication of Darwin to social affairs, what they called social Darwinism. And that's black, white, red, that's probably politically incorrect now, and yellow, likewise probably politically incorrect. And those categories have very little value in terms of saying anything meaningful about an individual in that category. Not truly meaningful in terms of that person's individuality. and most important in terms of that person's character and that person's mind, which are the only things that really should count when we're interacting with other people. So they have these very broad categories. And those were what they called the protected classes, the people that deserve special considerations, such as affirmative action programs, because of past history. So when you have a concept that really doesn't have any specific meaning, it's like an empty vessel, and it will be filled with something. And most of the time, it will be filled with politics. And this is exactly what happened here. And identity politics, which started to develop at the same time, that's what it got filled with. And ironically, in that process, true diversity of all peoples, whatever their so-called race or ethnicity, was forgotten or ignored. And it became instead the opposite of diversity. It became an orthodoxy that all must embrace and all must give homage to. And universities now had this whole mission about diversity. We're all about diversity. Their mission statements are all about diversity, with nobody knowing, well, what do you really mean by diversity? Right? It just, in effect, it means, well, you have to have certain numbers of these protected classes. Okay. And not everybody gets in. Not everybody gets to be a protected class. Even as diverse as they may be, they're not going to make it. So it became a political ideology. It also, and this is always important to remember, it also became an industry in universities. University, you know, university administrative offices have mushroomed, multiplied in just the last 30 years, 20 years. They're the tail now wagging the university dog. So there's that interest also. And don't forget the federal government and its role in policing these various anti-discrimination programs. So you had this illiberal ideology, right, of a diversity that's not a diversity. And you also have big government sort of empowering it through the money that over the years the feds have given to universities. Now it started out, you know, on the Sputnik crisis, the Russians got to put a satellite in space before we did, so we need to spend money on educating people in science and engineering and foreign languages because of our role in the world, et cetera. Then it just became this big boondoggle, all right? And the problem is, there's an old saying in England, if you signed up in the British Army, you got a shilling for signing up. So the saying was, he who takes the king's shilling is the king's man. In other words, he gets to tell you what to do. He tells you where to go, right? Where to fight. When you take money, there's always strings attached, particularly from the government. And that's the weapon over the years, those transfers to education, whether subsidized student loans or research money or whatever, that's how they can exert pressure on universities to do what they want them to do, okay? So it hasn't been really good for universities. The second point is that, and we all know here, the only true diversity that a university should be concerned with is the diversity of minds, of opinions, diversity of character. The more of that you have, the more creativity you get. But now we have an ideology that is an ironclad orthodoxy, right? If you stray outside of it, you will be canceled, all right? You will be shut up. You'll be shouted down if you try to speak on campus. Everybody has to toe the line. And this, just in the last 4 years, has really, really gotten a lot worse, as I'm sure you all know. Okay, so there's that diversity. Now, the problem is we don't have enough real diversity, or we don't acknowledge enough real diversity. And the fact is, diversity goes way, way beyond our artificial categories of race. The highest category we should have is ethnicity. Ethnicity points to something real, because ethnicity involves not just physical characteristics, it involves a history, it involves a language usually, it involves culture, faith, that all those things that combine to make people who they are as a people, and individuals who they are as an individual. And in the story of America, this is a very important point, because though these days people like to talk about, particularly, the left, the woke, well, this is a white country, it was made for white males. Everybody was white. And it's like, if you look at the incredible variety and diversity of peoples that settled the United States in its history, starting before the Revolution, all the way up to the great immigration that came in the 1890s into 1925 from Eastern Europe, from Poland, from Southern Italy, all these different places. All right. White is useless for capturing anything meaningful about that diversity. It's an empty vessel into which has been poured what? White privilege, systemic racism, white supremacy, etc. That is a political weapon for leveraging political power. But that was the reality of the colonies before the Revolution. Even if you just take England, you say, well, they all came from England, they're all white. No, there were Scots, there were Irish, there were Scots-Irish or Ulster-Irish. Scots that had been settled in that northwest corner of Ireland by Queen Elizabeth as a bulwark against Spanish and French incursions. There were borderlanders, Northern England, and the Highland Scots and the Lowland Scots. There were religious differences. Well, that, of course, which is why a lot of people left, because their religion was, they were disenfranchised. Their faith was not legal. They settled in different places on this continent. So you have regional differences. They developed different customs, different accents, different ways of speaking, different notions of honor and different notions of manners, an immense variety. And the founders recognized that because the Constitutional Convention had delegates from all these different places. And the founders had two main sorts of concerns that they had to deal with when they wrote this document. The first and most important, which we tend to forget, they didn't write the Constitution and create the federal government to solve problems, all right? Problems are solved lower down in communities, in counties, in states. That's where the closer to the people involved is the best place for that to be. Their primary goal was to protect freedom, political freedom, individual freedom. That was it. And that's where identity politics is really against the values of the Constitution. Because people are taken one at a time. And those rights are innate in them, unalienable. So the second was, how do we make an unum out of all these pluribus, all this diversity I was just talking about? On the economic level, that led to the Civil War in part. The interest of the plantations was different from the interest of the industrialists. It led to a war because it wasn't just about interest, it was about principles too. Don't let anybody tell you that Civil War wasn't about ending slavery. It absolutely was. It was about principles as well. So they figured, how are we going to do that? Well, the first problem about forestalling tyranny, we all know, came from divided and balanced government. Don't let power concentrate, which is precisely what the progressives are trying to do and have been doing for 100 years. Concentrate it and you centralize it and you take over more and more of a society's functions. Can't let that happen, so we'll divide the government. But the other thing was federalism. Federalism respected that diversity because the states were sovereign. They had a lot of authority, a lot of power, rule-making power over a lot of their lives. And so they also had a check on the federal government in various ways, mainly through the Senate, because the state houses appointed senators. They weren't popularly elected. That's why the progressives got, I think it was 1917, a constitutional amendment that senators would be popularly elected. That was a huge blow to federalism because the Senate was a very important, is supposed to be a very important check on the chief executive, isn't it? Because the chief executive can't get cabinet members approved without the advice and consent of the Senate. The Senate declares war, et cetera. It has all these powers as a check. So that was a blow. And so gradually you start seeing not the American peoples, right? Not the American peoples in all their diversity and all their contrasting, conflicting goods, things they pursue, but the people. But we were the people only on special occasions, like ratifying the Constitution. All the people or peoples voted to ratify the Constitution. When we amend the Constitution, when we are at war generally, right? Or even though then there are some, even in the good war, World War II, there were parts of the country that weren't for that. The rest of the time in our daily lives, we have this diversity, and respecting that diversity, acknowledging that diversity, made it more difficult for coalitions to form, as Madison talks about in Federalist 10, in order to take power, which would lead to, of course, the more populous states dominating the less populous states. Again, that's why the progressives now want to get rid of the Electoral College. That's why they want to make the Senate representational, which would be a disaster. Those last supports of federalism would be gone, and you would start seeing this attempt to make a unified, in mentality, in beliefs, government, which is exactly what turned out with the politicized form of diversity that we see in identity politics. It's all uniform, it's all the same, and you got to be part of that, and you have to bow to those idols, or you are going to be canceled. And if we think that, well, that's not going to happen. Listen, if you told me even 20 years ago that the stuff going on today would be going on, I would have said, oh, no, we can't. No, we better believe that it can happen. And somehow we have to figure out a way to resist that. And I think one way is to remember this history. Remember the people we are because of our diversity and the wonderful balance between the unum and the pluribus that we created, so that you don't have to give one up or the other because of federalism, because we have these different states. If you don't like what's going on in a state, Leave. Look at all the people leaving California because they don't like the taxes. Unfortunately, where they go, they usually Californicate where they go. All right. And they turn them into little mini Californias, but still you have an option. When there is no federalism, you don't have an option other than leaving the country because there's no escaping the federal government because it has sovereignty. So somehow we have to expose the phony diversity and fight against it. And let me finish with some suggestions, at least on the level of universities. One thing I think is important is reaching out and educating, let's see, trustees, alumni, etc. They often don't know what's going on in the universities because when they go to fundraise with alumni, they don't mention any of this wacky stuff, right? No, it's about the football team or it's about their music department and they need some cellos or something that, like that. And don't give a dime to them when they come panhandling you. Don't give a dime to them. Just say, well, wait a minute. You guys have this program here, right? You have these policies here. These are illiberal. They're probably contrary to the Constitution, right? I don't want my money going to that. I don't want my money paying for that. That's one thing you can do. Also, trustees, often they're just prominent people, in business or whatever. And a lot of them need to be informed about what's going on. And just ordinary people, right? We talk to say, this is what's happening. This is what my kid is learning, right? At woke university. This is what they're bringing home. Because this, again, let me say, what we've seen first through the Trump administration, which was unprecedented, right? And now these guys aren't fooling around. They really think that they are going to fundamentally transform this country, which means it will not be this country anymore. So with that happy ending and upbeat finale, we will, I guess, have Annie will take your questions.
Well, thanks for that information, Bruce. As questions are coming in, let me ask you one question.
Mm-hmm.
It has genuinely been a question of mine for almost a year now. Why is there so much hate toward white men in America anyways? Why?
Well, that's an interesting question because I was encountering this phenomenon as far back as the late 90s. You started getting the association of this meaningless term white, okay? I mean, Arabs and Jews are white, they're Caucasians, so they begin to attach to it various negative selfishness, greed, various psychoses surrounding women, a creepy interest in guns and cowboys, a whole suite of just ridiculous stereotypes. All right. Again, why? Because it's a political weapon. Number one, it's a political weapon. It's to, I think, as Zelensky said, you freeze your opponent and then you vilify him, right? The other problem is that there are too many white people of power, who have this weird masochistic streak in them, and they seem eager to be, beaten like that rhetorically, and to kneel and to apologize. And my feeling is this is one of the malign after effects of segregation. You know, not legal segregation done away with, but there's still a lot of self-segregation, right? Or segregation for other reasons. Now, there are the more successful minorities who don't go live in downtown Detroit or Baltimore. No, they go to the same zip codes, their fellow professionals or whatever, and they live it. So a lot of white people don't have a lot of experience with this diversity. And the only way you can really understand is if you live among people, if you go to school with them, right? And after a while, unless you're just a really hardcore racist, of which there are very few of those left anywhere, most of them are up in the foothills someplace, then you begin to see something. I mean, very, you know what? You can't look at somebody and look at the color of their skin and say that's a good person or that's a bad person, right? And that includes white people too. That includes everybody of all the incredible variety of appearance and ethnicity, et cetera. You can't do that. So it's a weird phenomenon that comes from being insulated, right? In a certain socioeconomic niche of always being around people like you, even if they're people of color, so-called. You know, if they're in your rich zip code and they have the same, you know, stockbroker and they, you know, same Tesla as you do, then, right? What's that? What's diverse about that? You know, but you got to get out around, and a lot of this is your upbringing, which you don't choose. Obviously, we don't choose our upbringing. I didn't choose my upbringing, obviously, but I was lucky. I ended up in probably one of the most diverse rural areas of California. And that's what I learned, you know. By the time, at the end of it, it's like, I can't point to that person and say, he's good, he's bad, because of their so-called race. I had to know who they were, how they lived, you know. And it's the lack of that experience, I think, that makes a lot of white people fall for this, which they think is virtue, but really isn't. It's more masochism, if you ask me.
Well, thanks for answering that question. Let's start on our audience's questions as they're coming in. Tony is asking, using a chess analogy, the left has entered the end game phase and is close to declaring checkmate. What will checkmate look like, and when will it happen? Within the next 4 years?
Well, I wouldn't put the game that far. I wouldn't put them one move away from checkmate. They've got a long ways to go. And I get a question a lot about, oh, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? It's like, and I'm a pessimist. I will always find the glass half empty. All right. But if I rational and I think about it, the extraordinary, the only word for it, stupidity of Biden's first, or the Biden cabal's first 100 days, all right, is brewing a huge backlash. Just as Obama did. When he overreached with Obamacare and with the near $1 trillion stimulus that was just a giveaway, right? There's still 75 million Trump voters. 75 million people who voted for him. That's a lot. I don't think they've changed teams. I think they're hopping mad. And what we'll see, and what will tell us a lot, is in 2 years, the midterms. Because as Obama himself said, the Democrats in 2010 got a shellacking, as he called it. Then they went ahead and then later lost the Senate. You could see very much the same thing. And for that, we can thank the founders for regularly scheduled elections. Right? Unlike parliamentary governments where people call elections, we have regularly scheduled elections. So we the people all have the opportunity to change course. And I think there's a very good chance that's going to happen. The border is a disaster. Trump won because of the border and his promise, which he fulfilled to straighten it out. That's a disaster. People aren't happy with that. Inflation is starting to tick up. Whether or not it gets to the point where we start seeing interest rates rise, they're very low, historically unprecedented to be this low. So I think there's a lot of factors that there's a lot of more pieces on the board, a lot of counterplay for conservatives, Republicans, that we have to see how those play out. And in terms of what's it going to look like, just read 1984. I mean, that's what it's going to look like. Or look at China with their social credits. I can see them trying to pull something like that. Hopefully, we can hope that Americans, there's still a lot of old school Americans, and they're not going to let that happen.
Okay, that makes me feel a little better. But no, I do agree. I don't think they are that far. Or I don't. Well, they think they are getting close to.
They are, yeah, yeah.
But okay, let's go to next question. Jack is asking, why are liberal universities the breeding grounds for these illiberal ideas?
Well, here's thank you for that question, because that brings us to an issue of terminology. And one thing that I think needs to stop is we need to stop calling progressives liberals. They are not liberals. And to answer the question, it's because they're not liberals. So of course they aren't. When I was in college, they were still liberals. All right. They were left-leaning, sort of, the professors. And they had all the right opinions about, Vietnam and all these sorts of things. But they were still, first and foremost, trained in their profession. And you sometimes couldn't tell from any given lecture or any feedback on an essay or anything that they were left. You knew they were. Progressives are different. Those liberals were always in favor of the First Amendment. Always. They were fighting against the free speech movement at Berkeley, right? They were always against restricting speech. Now, that could have been tactical for the real hardcore leftists, because, they use that as a tool so they could take it away from everybody else once they got power, which sort of is what they're trying to do now. So we shouldn't use that word liberal. I mean, that's spit in the wind when you're trying to control how people use language, but they're not liberals. They're progressives, and they've created a progressive left university, not a liberal university. The liberal university, you described the university probably in the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, into the beginning of the 60s. By the end of the 60s, it was starting to transform. Once that older generation retired, you started getting the vets of the long march through the institutions started taking those positions. Then you started it started becoming wacky, which is what it is now.
Okay, so it's basically the terminology that's confusing a lot of us. Well, yeah. I just refer to them as anti-Americans. That's all I use. That's my terminology for them.
Yeah, but historically, I mean, the progressives start in as an idea in the 1880s, 1890s. The first progressive president is Wilson, and a lot of the foundations of it. The next big leap was FDR. So already by that point, you have gone a long way from the Constitution towards the technocracy, which is what progressives want. A centralized technocratic power of experts. We've seen what a job they did with COVID, huh? Of experts who will know better than the citizens what's good for them and be able to implement it. And that's on the same continuum as the more heinous collectivist political movements like communism and fascism. So it's no surprise that we see a lot of that kind of behavior, particularly in the last year. The readiness, the eagerness to use violence as a political weapon. I mean, that's Weimar Germany in the 30s with the fascists and the communists, duking it out in the streets of Berlin. We're back to that sort of model. So that's their heritage. All right. Liberalism informs a lot of the Constitution, not all of it. It's not a completely liberal document. For one thing, the founders were pessimistic about human nature, and most liberals tend to be more, believers in progress and improvement and all those sorts of things. But so yeah, that's, of course, anti-American. Anti-Americans, they don't like this political order and this culture to be a world leader. If we were Luxembourg, they wouldn't care about us for 5 seconds, right? The hegemon, the global hegemon, is not liked by anybody. Even his allies or its allies don't like them. So I think that's what's going on there.
Understood. There's the next question. Myra is asking, did openly displayed hate toward white men began after Black 1,000 Men March sometimes into 1997?
I'm not seeing a sort of cause and effect relationship there. I think it's more a long-term effect of what happened to curriculum in schools. The race industry created the curriculum that, identity politics curriculum, diversity demands. As when we talk about the universities and their malign influence, we have to remember it's not just about the universities. Universities, you go to the top of the heap, the Ivies and all those are supposed to be really good, which they're not as much anymore. They train the professors that go to state schools and state universities that train teachers, K through 12 teachers. Do you see how it trickles down? It's trickled down bad ideology. And I know from my own kids when they were in grammar school, and I would tell the teacher, hey, I'll come in and help you out in the classroom and, maybe teach chess or something. And of course they liked that. Of course, my motive was to spy on them, to see what they were doing. And so I saw a lot. I could see it. I could see the posters they put on. I could see how they explained things. And I could see how it started way back in some incoherent version of Jacques Derrida or Michel Foucault in some college seminar. It trickles down out of the university. And I used to make this mistake too, even into the 90s. So, most people don't care about professors in this country. That's why a lot of them have a chip on their shoulder, because in France, oh my gosh, in France, a professor is like an authority. You know what I mean? He's a celebrity. This is America, right? This is a frontier country. We don't really care about pencil necks and tenderfeet and, Buck Larnon and all that. It's like, so they don't like that, right? So they have a chip on their shoulder. So you see all this stuff, and I saw it in school when my kids were in grammar school. And you have enough generations go through that now. We're talking going on 50 years now. You have enough generations go through that. It's going to change. Remember what the Jesuits said. Give me the boy at the age of 7 and I'll give you the man, right? In other words, they spend a lot of time, and this can have an influence, and it has had an influence. It's gone through every level of society. I mean, we talk something that we never thought back in the 60s, and corporations were evil, right? They were the enemy. We'd never see them collaborating with the left. But all those people, particularly in the tech industry, when did they come of age? What was kind of education did they go through? Right? So it's no surprise that they turn, particularly when it's what the Catholic Church used to call plenary indulgence. You're going to go to crusades. Here's a plenary indulgence. You're good on anything you do. All right. It's like, hey, I'm siding with, the people saying Georgia's election laws are Jim Crow, which is a preposterous statement. They're Jim Crow, and it's like, okay, you're virtuous. You're on the side of the angels. You may be rich as Croesus, and in reality, don't give a damn about us other than consumers of your products. But we'll give you a pass because your politics are right. You see, and that's a phenomenon that goes all the way back to the French Revolution, when some aristocrats thought that they could save their head by throwing in with the revolutionaries, and some did, some didn't. But
Okay. Let's go to next question from Stephen asking, how dangerous is something like making Washington, D.C. the 51st state? Is that why it is coming fast and has already passed in the House today? Is anything stopping it?
Yeah, the House could pass anything it wants right now. First part, it would be a disaster. You cannot make the seat of government also have 2 senators. Think about it. And all Washington, D.C. is the federal government with some slums around it. Okay. So this is like going back to some monarch city in the 17th century. And you're going to give them 2 senators? Oh, that would upset everything, which is why they want to do it. Fortunately, and I don't claim to be an expert on this, but I think it's pretty explicit in the Constitution that you can't do that. That it was to remain separate from the political order, because it was where the political order was housed. And it was dangerous enough to have all these guys with power in one place, but you're not going to make it worse by letting them have 2 senators and a state and everything that goes with that. And the whole issue of no taxation without representation, that's an easy fix. If that's really a problem, I suspect it's not really that much of a problem. They do have a representative, right, in Congress. Then okay, fix that with the tax code. But we already see how bad it is to have the federal government concentrated in DC. I think it's had an effect on this Supreme Court. I think it had an effect on it in the Obamacare case. John Roberts got a case of Stockholm syndrome. They're too close. They're in the same social circles, right? There's too much social pressure. And they'd like to claim, well, no, we're objective and we're immune from that. But there's been some decisions that you don't have to be a constitutional scholar to know are hinky. You know what I mean? And a lot of it is that pressure. And now they're talking about packing the Supreme Court. And a lot of people says, oh, that didn't work. It didn't work under FDR. Oh yeah, it worked. He didn't pack the court, but he put the fear of FDR in them, and their decisions on New Deal policies begin to change. Right? So the point is not actually to pack the court. The point is to intimidate a court that seems to be opposed to your policies so that they aren't opposed to your policies. So that's kind of a common misconception that, oh, well, FDR failed packing the court. He achieved his aim, which is to get the decisions that he wanted for the New Deal. You see what I mean? So that's going to be an interesting, and again, and the DC thing it's forbidden by the Constitution. So we'll have to see how it plays out.
That is very true. Let me go ahead and read a comment or a question from our comment section. I think we have time for 2 or 3 more questions. So this question comes from Michael. He's asking, or he's saying, the left has always needed a target to hate in order to unite them and blame their pain and failure. The target of their hate has just changed with time. It's been Blacks and then Jews, Catholics, and more recently the rich and then white people. is there a way to wake up the supporters of this movement and make them see that they are no different, they being left is no different than Klan or Nazis or Soviet or any other political ideology united by their hatred?
Yeah, I mean, that's well said, and it's absolutely right. And now we come to the point where we always come, what's to be done? All right, famous question of Vladimir Lenin. No, what is to be done? Well, we knew what he thought would be done. So what's to be done? You have people who say more outreach, more persuasion, more calling attention to this, which we do nonstop, right? We're doing that all the time. It's happening all the time. And here's where my pessimistic side, it seems to me, and historically, that people get to a certain state of, let's say, degeneration, all right, of corruption, of ruin. It usually takes some catastrophe, all right, to wake people up. We have to remember everything that's going on today with the riots and all that stuff, those are luxuries that we can afford, because we can afford to have a large population of young people who don't work, right? Who have leisure time, whose sustenance is not threatened, who are not going to starve, right? And so they can do this. When it starts to become expensive, then they won't. Now, one practical thing, which I don't think is going to happen, is to stop the indulgence of the rioting and the looting and the arson and all of that, to stop it. And that means that you have credible deterrence, which means that when you're apprehended, you're going to be booked, you're going to be charged, and you're going to be tried, and you're going to pay one way or the other. These kids now know, even if they get apprehended, they'll be taken to the station, they'll take some information, they'll turn around and let them go. They know that. Because they know that, they will continue to do it. So, I mean, the trouble with the first scenario is, when that moment comes, it doesn't always go back to a restoration of what's right. It can go really wrong, as Germany did in the 30s, and it can go in a whole nother direction. So that's a development we don't want to see. Hopefully the political process, as it did in 2016, the political process will be the way that it gets turned around.
Well, we shall hope so. Here, we have time for one more question, so I'm going to put this one in. Brenda asked, I honestly don't understand the videos I've seen of white people kneeling and apologizing for being white. It seems more like fear that I see. Do you have any comments on that?
Oh, I think part of it's fear, but it's fear of not being with the in crowd. There's a very juvenile sort of air to all of this that we're seeing, right? Who are the cool kids, right? Well, the cool kids are the one fighting for social justice and racial justice, and they're out there. And we have this cultural romance of revolution. You know what I mean? That it's a status symbol. It's attractive to be out there on the barricades, in the streets, right? How else does a thug, a murderer, a psychopath like Che Guevara, who, by the way, happens to be a white guy, or was a white guy, he's not a person of color, how does he get to be an icon? Well, partly he was a pretty good looking guy, and the famous photographer took a picture of him, it's the one you see on all the, but it's because in the West, since the French Revolution, there has been this fashionable attraction to revolution. And it's a status thing. And it's showing your solidarity with the revolutionaries. Also, it is virtue signaling, obviously. It's like you're displaying your superiority to all those, rube Americans in flyover country who are so stupid as to believe in patriotism and God and bitterly cling to their guns and religion, deplorable, smelly Walmart shoppers. We're not them, right? We're better than they are. We're on your side. We're kneeling to you to show our solidarity and our difference from them. So a lot of it's fashion, and fad. Doesn't make it any less dangerous, obviously. But I think clearly that's a lot of what it is.
Oh boy. Okay. I'm gonna try to squeeze one more in there. If you could give this one a little shorter answer. So question says, and I'm gonna try to not butcher this word. Since the 1978 Buckley decision, has there been any other Supreme Court case that tried to get us back to the constitutional idea of equality? And why is that not possible?
There have been several in recent. There were the Michigan Law School case, I think, Retner, I think it was. There was Abigail Fisher, University of Texas. There were two of those, two cases, Fisher cases. In all of them, even when they said, the justices said that there's a huge problem with these affirmative action programs, in the end, still relied on Powell's diversity is a compelling state interest that delivers, good things to the student's experience, even though there's no empirical evidence that that's true. In fact, most of the evidence is the other way. You see more segregation by race. You see terrible outcomes for many, many Black students who have been mismatched to the university. That is, a less prestigious university, it would have been fine. And that would be true of anybody. That would be true of me if you stuck me in the MIT math department, right? I wouldn't last 1 week. So it's not a racial thing. It's just you can't put people of a certain level of preparation in a higher level of rigor. They're going to get frustrated. They're going to drop out. They're going to change to a easy major. They're going to take 6-7 years to graduate, et cetera. It's again, this is what's the most interesting thing. The progressives always end up hurting the people they claim to care so much about. And California is the showcase of that whole attitude, So I'm not sure if there's another one. Now you have this one case coming of the Asian students, right? Because they have been blatantly discriminated against. And that one, if it gets to the Supreme Court, may have some promise. But the Supreme Court's thinking, we've had 50 years of affirmative action. That's a third rail issue. Well, we'll pass on that,
Hypocrisy. Well, here's the very last question for you, Bruce.
Mhm.
Where can our audience go to follow you, learn more about everything that you cover, and get more informed?
Front Page Magazine. Front Page Magazine. I'm in there all the time, probably too much. There's a on the author, there's a archive which goes back quite a ways. I think I started working with David when under the old Heterodoxy, the paper tabloid. That was 99, 2000, 90, something like that. So been so that's that also at Hoover. My page has an archive also with other stuff. Okay.
Fantastic. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and information with us, Bruce. We are very grateful.
Thank you. Always a pleasure.
Absolutely. And to our audience who stayed with us until now, we appreciate you very much. And please do remember, these webinars are brought to you for free by David Horowitz Freedom Center and the Glazov Gang. So if you'd like to support these webinars, all you got to do is go to frontpagemag.com and consider making 100% tax deductible donation. With that being said, stay safe and goodbye.